My name is Monika Weiss. I'm an artist. I work with time. Time is my primary medium and context and canvas, moments of suspended time and also moments in history. And I've been trained really as a musician, and I listen to Bach a lot in my life every day. And romantic music especially was important to me early in my life. And so was Goya. I don't remember when I first saw Goya, because I think I was a very small child when I saw at least an illustration of the May 3rd. And I remember always thinking about that painting, the arms up in that sort of gesture of complete surrender, but also strangely the beauty of that gesture. Goya's self-portrait, for me, is about gaze, very prolonged, profound, observing, tough-looking. And gaze means power, but also means reflection. It's a moment when Goya was in a difficult moment. It was a very difficult moment, transitioning into complete silence. From what I understand, he heard sounds in his head, but really, in fact, was immersed in this abyss of dark inability to hear. I feel like that suspension of his gaze inside of the empty background is really telling so much to me. It's just his face, his hair, and then nothing, as if an evocation of that nothing. And I work with silence in my work. I think silence is important. I sometimes require silence from the people who come to participate in my art projects, but also inside of my films, and of course inside of my drawings. There is a lot of silence and empty space. In my work, two laments, Canto 4, one of the 19 silent films. And Canto 4 is the only one that is remaining completely silent without my music. The protagonist is gradually bending down, and it's a very close view, very intimate view. It's a portrait, and the woman whom I choreographed is bending down all the way down outside of the film frame, and then gradually, very slowly coming back up and opening her eyes and looking at you. And that gaze is an accusation, but also a profound wondering and a question. The scale of the portrait itself is also striking to me when I saw it in the museum, how tiny it is. Like I could feel his eyes on me in the gallery from a distance. In my work, Canto 4, the scale of the face is much larger than life. It's the size of the entire wall, so that gaze is meant to be the scale of a landscape. In the Canto 4, a poem appears by the late poet Mina Alexander, a poem called Moksha, devoted to Nirbhaya, a woman that was tortured, raped, and killed in 2012 in a bus going through New Delhi in India. And Mina Alexander's poem appears in that silent canto, only 2 lines at a time, as a kind of testimony. So when I think about the gaze, I think about not only seeing and the power of the look, the prolonged gazing, but also the power of witnessing, of being with somebody. I've been working with Lament as a vehicle for this act of witnessing and participation in states being outside of specific time or outside of specific event, yet in response to events and sites of trauma. Also in the same series, Two Laments, 19 Cantos, Canto 1 begins with a murmur of voices.
तुमने इसे मेरे
And the murmur of voices, the chorus, which I composed from recorded voices of women who read a text I wrote in 2015 on behalf of Nirbhaya, translated into Sanskrit, Bengali, Urdu, Hindi, Oriya, and other minor languages, as they are called, in India, creates a polyphonic counterpoint to what we see is a woman in a very still position, lifting her arms up as if she was stating some sort of a silent plea or trying to fly off of that sorrow. In that work, I invited a number of women to perform gestures of silent lamentation. In sad foreboding of what is to come, there is this amazing darkness surrounding the figure, and the figure of the lamenting body is kneeling. The protagonist is surrounded by dark, layered tempest of events. I love how we see the marks and the rhythm of that tempest. It's very, very polyphonic, very musical actually as a work. And I love how the figure is taking on the entire light coming from somewhere that we don't see. In fact, we are in a position of standing and confronting the person who's lamenting, kneeling. We see that this human being is in a state of despair, that maybe pleading for some kind of hope, or at least in a dialogue with some higher power. He's looking up into the sky, into the heavens. For me, this is also a very nocturnal situation. I know it must be night, at least symbolically. It's the night of life, the night of the world. And it's in the Disasters of War series, and which is probably the closest to my heart. And we stand with the protagonist. We are on the inside of this world of darkness and the swirling forces and those clouds and barely discernible shapes around the figure. And again, the arms are coming up, and I feel like he is directing the space, conducting the space. In weeping and wailing, the figure is kneeling down once again and looking up towards the heavens or towards the power. But what I find important is that the figure is against the wall. There's nowhere to go. It's this sense of entrapment that is very important in this piece. The arms and the hands are much higher, and I think in this work Goya is investigating the gestures of hands, how much they can say. The silence of this gesture is really very loud to me. Actually, to me, it evokes the painting that I remember from my early years, 3rd of May, in that sort of act of desperation. I also think it makes me think of how lament is something we perform, we enact. It's a moment beyond words, after language, when everything has been said, and the only thing left is the entire body coming together into this ultimate gesture of protest or plea. Bon Voyage is a work in which I recognize that feeling of nocturnal landscape that I so much appreciate in Goya's work, especially in the Capriccios. The sense of suspension in space or even outside of space, certainly outside of normal, the everyday space, the way we understand it. So this is the space that we don't understand, in the uncanny space. The tones of gray, this beautiful aquatint, the washes and the grain of the paper together create this massive material experience of being suspended, almost as if inside of a cloud of ash. And the only thing that happens, amidst this darkness is this light, almost like a light that is suddenly appearing from a source we don't know, but extremely acutely making us aware of frightening, unrecognizable faces that maybe used to be human, or perhaps in our dreams became non-human. To me, they are more like masks, approximations of what human face should look like, but doesn't. And in that moment of dreaming and being between awake and asleep, or perhaps between being alive and in the embrace of death. I also thought how much this particular print makes me feel cold, as if the temperature of the work is extremely cold, maybe because of that frightening context of nightmare, flight and fall, and very harsh light that hits only parts of the flying unison of the bodies and faces. In Koiman 2, Years Without Summers is a work that I began in 2017 and finished only a year ago, which is composed of 24 silent films and 24 sound compositions and also 24 drawings. I was inspired by Schubert's Winterreise, the great German romantic composer, and his series of 24 songs for voice and piano. In the process of working on the series, I found out that he may have been inspired by the 1815 Tambora explosion, which resulted in the Year Without Summer in 1816. A lot of artists and writers were inspired by and deeply affected by a sudden coldness and snow in Italy in the summer, and actual darkness of the skies and ashes traveling throughout the world. I've been looking at writings of those who were alive at the time, their diaries, and people who were on ships and boats who wrote that they couldn't see their own hands stretched in the ashes. I still feel that we're living in times when we could hardly see a hand stretched symbolically. Something of this piece, Bon Voyage, makes me think of Schubert Winterreise and this idea of this wandering in the coldness and dark, the beauty of it, but also the sort of frightening solitude. In one of the pieces in Koiman 2, Years Without Summer, a drawing appears called Nocturne 2, in which I poured layers of charcoal into resin until it became tangibly so, like a sculpted cloud of ash. In Goya's drawing for Sleep of Reason, this beautiful explosion of brown wash happens. And that brown tone and that tonality of the brown and the gesture of the brush, the flow of the fluid takes over the figure. The figure seems to be burdened under it. The figure seems to be not only sleeping. I loved this quietude of this piece as compared to the final print. The entire background, the whole sheet of paper comes to life and it's moving in several different directions at the same time. There's this ascension of the brown wash come all the way to the left upper corner. And there in the midst of that wash we see barely visible, horrifying, but also diminished by that gesture faces, almost as if the drawing was stronger than the nightmare. But the striking thing for me in the midst of that space is this darkness, the stain, which sits on top of the body and seems to be closer to me than the figure itself. And so as if the abstraction is taking over, the stain is spilling over and in front of the sleeping, dreaming or praying body of the protagonist. And I also love that gray stain on the right corner. There's this another form of stain, maybe an actual stain. It makes me think of what happened to that sheet of paper when Goya was working on it. To what extent his body was involved in making this tremendous movement in such a small scale of the work. So powerful. The cloud and the stain around the figure, which we recognize as potentially Goya himself in his studio, in his atelier, but also there are faces around in that cloud hovering around him. And at least one of them reminds us of Goya himself. So there's a doubling happening, an echoing of his presence in space and in this world, and especially at the precipice between awakeness and dreaming. And this moment is so beautifully depicted in the drawing. Anamnesis, Canto 1, part of the Anamnesis 2 series, is a piece in which I invited performers to lie down with me in a large white shroud made of light white silk fabric, placed on the ground of the museum in Porto, with cameras suspended off the ceiling, filming our lying down, lamenting and drawing around our bodies. And I choreographed that several hours of performance in silence, which was captured onto the cameras and then later became a projection, while the shroud was traces of our bodies and our drawn marks, which we were drawing with our eyes closed, according to my choreography. The act of lying down, being horizontal, which is very important in my practice overall, is an expression of a certain type of response to verticality, and verticality to me signifies a posture of empowerment or power over subjects, a military posture, a posture of superiority. So it's a philosophical and poetic gesture against verticality, for horizontality and humbleness. I've also recorded the voices of the women participants in a separate sound session from which I created the sound composition for this project.
Com panos. Eu guardo-te com panos. Pele da terra. De onde saímos.
Goya's landscape, this tremendous diagonal tension made into a landscape. It's a tension between the grey, the cold, silver grey of the sky, the clouds which seem to be gradually taking over the space. But it's a landscape that is not offering redemption or peace. It's a romantic landscape that was changed into a frightening body. I feel the landscape in this piece is like a body. It's bending away from the impending sky. It's almost as if the sky and the cloud is touching the trees and pushing them in this very unusual, dramatic way towards the mountain, which is piercing the trees. And so together it creates a conflict. And somewhere there in the upper right corner, we see a building suspended inside of this mountain that is almost alive. And everything is moving. Nothing is stable in this landscape. And I feel that it's the sky that is taking over that creates this symbolic and actual feeling of change and impending doom. But I love the way everything seems to be also stretched, as if I was looking at an instrument, as if I was looking at it inside of a piano, and the trees were stretched strings. It's a very sonic piece to me. It feels like it's about to create a huge, deep sound that is both cacophonic and polyphonic. And I don't know if it's the sound of the future or the sound of the past, or perhaps it is both. Shroud Całuny is a film, but also a public project which took place on the grounds of a forgotten, abandoned and ruined former concentration camp for Jewish women in Gruenberg, Germany, now Zielona Góra, Poland. In that project, I invited local women living in Zielona Góra today to inhabit the remaining empty and ruined square located today in the middle of renovated city of Zielona Góra, to spend time, to silently lament, to lie down in the debris, and to leave black scarves in that debris as a trace of our presence. And I was filming that moment of duration and moment of lament and moment of silence from a small airplane flying around and above the site of this former camp, today completely forgotten and unknown to the inhabitants of the city of Zielona Góra. I was interested in how that particular wound in the space of this small city looks from above. The view from above interests me because it offers a view from a distance, a view that flattens the experience, the opposite of the intimate view, of the touching. And it is also mapping. It gives a sense of understanding of that wound in the body of the city understood as a living body that bears traces of trauma. My work is predicated on the act of unforgetting. In this case, in the piece called Shrouds, I felt that it was important to unforget the abandoned square in the middle of the city. Drawing Letter from 2006 is a public project that was organized by the Drawing Center in New York at the World Financial Center Winter Garden, across from the ground zero where workers were still searching for the remains of the victims of September 11th attacks. In this project, the Winter Garden, in which I covered by large sheets of canvas the entire floor around the palm trees, I invited the pedestrians, the everyday people, to join me in the act of lying down and drawing around our bodies silently while we listened to sound composition that I installed in the pits around the trees, the palm trees, which could be heard as we were lying down and crawling gradually on the canvas in the common collective gestures of presence in response to the absence of those who perished in the attacks. I was interested in evoking this lying down and silence because it felt to me it was impossible to respond through words to the trauma and the location. So there was a kind of an act of mirroring but also honoring. In this work, the two figures are engaged in a dance-like ritual and movement and motion through space, which I feel has no definition, is an infinite space. Goya has marked very slight suggestion of people watching, but in fact, overall, it's again a space that is outside of any specific location. It's this eternal dance of two bodies struggling together. For me, the bull has a much stronger presence. The bull has all of the major light on its body. The bull is the hero, the bull is the protagonist, and the bullfighter seems to be swirling around almost like a dervish. His clothing is moving and beautifully depicted by the drawn lines. And there is this amazing shadow again. It's a shadow that almost looks like a lake or like a sea or like an ocean. I don't feel here in this work that Goya is glorifying the bullfighting. It seems to me much more to be about a ritual itself and the act of being suspended in that moment of struggle and fight rather than the bullfighting as such, even though I think this piece is based on a text about bullfighting and it is very much, part of history surrounding Goya. This is number 13 in the Disasters of War, one of the 8 plates devoted to violence against women. And what I find really important in this piece is how the light is cast. The light is first and foremost visible beyond frightening and threatening architecture. It's the light beyond the columns at the scene of the crime, at the scene of the atrocity. The two dark figures, which I think are the soldiers or enemy soldiers, are targeting the woman who is almost about to succumb. She's cast in this strong white light, as if angelic or uplifting her presence into the realm of light rather than the realm of darkness in which they are depicted. She makes me think of martyrs and martyrdom depicted in various other paintings and writings and texts. There is something noble about her body. There is something heroic about her gesture and her stretched arms. And again, the gestures of hands are so important in the series of Disasters of War, the way Goya shows that moment of refusal, but also very dignified protest. Her entire attire and her posture makes me think of sainthood, the martyrdom of virgins. And in that sense, I think there is some moral judgment. It's an observation. It's an acute observation, but there's also an artistic decision to cast this moment of violence against women in a specific light and with a specific meaning. Goya, Woman by Stream, I'm especially drawn towards the way the park or the forest is depicted as this layering of darkness, as something that is about to perhaps devour the figure of the woman, which she seems to be pensive and at the same time restful, at ease, but also deeply investigating something that is happening on the inside of her mind. So what we see is her body half nude, seated by a stream, as if becoming one with this natural landscape. And somewhere there in the midst of the nature, a figure of a man appears, just a head, very dark outline, barely visible face. And it's the same tone that the trees and the dark leaves and the rest of the natural environment. And I feel like, strangely, we don't know where the danger is looming. We just know that she's alone, and that by itself is perhaps an exposure to impending danger. That a woman in the space perhaps is not supposed to be alone. But there is an ambiguity in this work, a beautiful suspension. The meaning is not exactly disclosed. The stream seems to evoke almost a Narcissus story to me. In Goya's Funeral Folly, a shrouded figure is lying underground. A ghost is hovering amongst the crowd, composed of grotesque figures. The scene seems to imply a state between perception and imagination, between reality and dream. I love the thickness of this piece. It seems to be three-dimensional. It seems to layers upon layers of darkness, crowds of figures, none of them real. Perhaps all of them are real. And the hovering figure seems to be levitating above the one that is lying on the ground. And I feel like maybe it's all the same figures. They're all incarnations of that one lying body, now flying and seeing at the same time. Hence the levitation comes to mind. It's also a nightmare. It's also a kind of a horrific depiction of what history can be when events take place, when we allow for the violence to happen. And the work makes me think of Goya's black paintings, the silent and haunting murals in his late house, which I remember seeing in illustrations as a child, and which deeply frightened me, but also fascinated me. Cordian is a drawing from 2005 made with charcoal and rice paper, with found book pages from 1882 edition of Ujazdowski, Pisma, Polish Romantic poet, in which we see a profile view of a woman's body stretched, lying down, with almost headless, with an almost invisible head. This drawing was inspired by Hans Holbein, The Body of the Dead Christ. It has that view of the profile of the body that is both levitating but also heavily lying down, full of the gravity either of death or of sleep, and yet still dreaming. And so above where the head would be, we see 2 pages from Ujazdowski Pisma, in which the poet writes in that imaginary dialogue with his mother about distance and being far away, and about missing and longing. I find Ujazdowski poetry extremely important in that it was written in the language that was forbidden at the time, and the longing was not only the longing of the Romantic period, but also the longing of the lost country. At the time, Poland didn't exist at all. It was devoured by 3 surrounding empires and ceased to exist for 100 and some years. I'm interested in history, the way it erases cultures, nations, voices and lives, and I'm interested in unforgetting of those who are erased and abandoned. The monument nearby is named after Jyoti Singh, who was raped and killed in the age of 23 in New Delhi. in 2012, aka Nubaya. It is not a memorial for conquerors and war heroes, but rather for the victims of everyday violence who are forgotten and whom I propose to unforget. Suggesting an ancient sarcophagus filled with water and moving image, Nubaya is inspired by the long tradition of triumphal arches. In Nubaya, I place the triumphal arch down. I double it with its own mirrored version and make it into a sarcophagus. The triumphal arch no longer hovers above us. Instead, we bend down and see the water filling its cavity. And inside the water, we see the moving image. It represents and shows a woman shrouded in long black robe, moving very slowly in universally recognizable gesture of lament. She gradually morphs into another woman, and then another, gradually becoming a tree. 10 minutes away from the silent sculpture, after a journey through the park, one encounters a sound station, a place where we can hear the voice of Nubaya when she becomes a tree, a voice connoting Daphne, the mythological nymph who escaped rape by becoming a tree. I imagined how her skin would sound as it was becoming bark of a tree, how her voice would disappear into the sound of the wind. So that moment of sound marks the death of the woman, but also the reincarnation into a new life form. In a way of flying, what I see is a limitless space of darkness. But by contrast with other works of Goya, in which that darkness seems to be full of ash and full of clouds, this one seems to be of a cosmic scale. I feel like the multiple figures flying with those makeshift wings are flying into an outer space outside of that we can understand. Makes me think of the Icarus, makes me think of not only flying but also falling. The multitude of the figures makes me think of perhaps all human beings forever trapped in that attempt of ascension and flight, and yet forever falling the way Icarus did. Yet in that attempt, there is this beautiful hope, yes, in the attempt of ascending into the outer space. And by outer, I don't necessarily mean the real cosmos, but rather the outer as in outside of our everyday experience. The hope for levitation and flight that mystics and artists have shared for centuries, if not thousands of years, across the various cultures. In Goya's Giant, what we see is a solitary figure, seemingly seated atop of a horizon of a landscape. For me, it's quite an androgynous figure, although I can tell that it's probably a man. But the gender is really not important in this body of the giant. It's the body that is equal to the landscape. I love the flatness of that representation. It seems to be much more far away than the sliver of the landscape that we see very close to us. It's a projection, perhaps a dream. I can't tell if it's early morning, if it's at dusk or at dawn, but the light is about to change. Something is about to happen. What I really love about this piece is looking back, pensive, looking into the past. It tells me that we can learn something from the past. It's important to look back. But it also frightens me, because it's like the Orphic look. It's almost like looking back is about seeing again the trauma or seeing again the pain and re-experiencing what has happened. Makes me think of the silence of Eurydice walking behind Orpheus. Makes me think of what is he seeing? What is the giant seeing? Is he seeing us? He's not looking really down. He's seeing something there in the space, in this other universe, in this other way of life, in this other way of dreaming.